give you another example that seems to be very different, but it's very closely related, which is epidemics, right? We all came out from a major epidemic, the COVID one, but it turns out that 20 years before the COVID epidemic, network scientists, particularly Alessandro Vespignani, my colleague actually in Boston, and Romano Pastos-Satoras, have really started thinking deeply about how the structure affects the network. And what's interesting is that they realized that virtually all the models that existed for epidemic spreading were based on a random network model. And, and that's because no one had any better. And the way epidemics kind of looks at it is to say, well, I have what we call a spreading rate of the virus, which is lambda, which is the likelihood that if you are actually come close to someone who is infected, you will also get infected, right? And the question is, depending on what that spreading rate, what fraction of the population would be infected. And a key fundamental result of epidemic spreading, based on which all methods to eradicate epidemics is really rely on, is the finding that there is a critical lambda, meaning that if the spreading rate is under a threshold, the disease will die out naturally, right? Because if it's very hard to spread, then it just people are going to get cured or die before they could pass it on. And this is the basis why we're told to use condom against AIDS, right? Because it not only protects you, but it will decrease the epidemic threshold so that eventually the disease would die out. But it didn't work, right? In a sense that the AIDS epidemic was a good example that AIDS virus is very hard to pass on, right? And I don't gonna give you actually any ideas, but typical statistics shows that it takes about 300 sexual intercourses with somebody with the virus to pass it on. So it's very hard to pass it on, right? Yet, it spread like crazy. So based on the epidemic models, it was way under the spreading rate of critical threshold, and yet it spread. Why? Because the network is not random, right? Because not everybody has the same number of sexual partners, right? As I showed you earlier, but rather it's a scale-free network. And one of the features of scale-free networks is that the second moment of the distribution, the width is very, very large. It goes to infinity in a large system. And you could analytically show that the critical point at which the disease disappears is really the average degree divided by the second moment. However, this quantity is finite in a random network. In a scale-free network, k-square goes to infinity, which means critical points goes to 0, which is let's see, so the curve is like that. So the epidemic threshold actually disappears. So even a very weakly kind of infectious epidemic can and will spread because it will eventually get into the hubs. And the hubs will infect lots of other nodes, and the hubs will actually be in the permanent state of infection. They would always kind of be as a reservoir for the disease. And this was a game changer in the way we think about diseases. And this was the first time when we saw how important these hubs and the network structure is really to understand them. And of course, it was on this background that Alessandro Vespignani ended up developing a whole network-based method about 15 years ago to predict epidemics. And so the first it was tested actually in the H1N1 epidemic in 2009, where he predicted that the virus that starts from Mexico will actually pick up, and this is actually his simulation, and said how many people and how many cities will be infected. So this was a simulation done in 2009, and he predicted for the H1N1 that the virus will peak in November, which was a very unexpected prediction because most influenza-like viruses peak out on the Western Hemisphere in January or December. And everybody ridiculed him back in June when he published that, and he was absolutely right, and that had major policy consequences because there was actually a vaccine against that, against the H1N1. Well, not a vaccine, but well, actually it was a vaccine for that, but that was only arriving to the population in December. And he was predicting it's going to be too late, and it was too late, right? And why was this different? It's because the virus didn't start out from Southeast Asia, as most influenza viruses do, but came from Mexico, and therefore had a different route on the network. What really matters here is that in 2009, starting from 2009, we have a very accurate network-based prediction of how viruses will spread. And that was the reason why in 2019, December, in our institute where Alexander works now, we were already freaked out about H1N1, right? And we were shopping like a month before the close down happened. And I remember that I was supposed to be giving this very talk in March 2020. And I remember sending an email to the organizers, right, to say, hey, are you sure you're gonna do it? And I was told, yes, everything is okay in Denmark. That was a month before that, right? And we said, no, our data doesn't show, and we have a track of emails. And then even a week before the talk, I said, it's not gonna happen. Then I was told, it is gonna happen. And then 3 days before the talk, it was canceled, right? So that's why we're here today. So, and sure enough, you know, Alex Vespignani became the White House modeler, and this is already an H1N1 model, actually, of how this is spreading. And one of the reasons we were able to manage the kind of, and to make rational decisions is because the tool set was ready and available, and he kind of, everybody could run it for their own country. And I'm sure many of you were involved actually doing it here. And of course, this was a very interesting moment, like a tragic moment for society, but a great moment for network science, because everyone became a network scientist, right? At the dining table, people were talking about reproduction rate and the role of the hubs and contract tracing, things you were using language that previously, 6 months before, you could only hear at the network science conference, right?